Royale is making waves. It's a new approach to the Battle Royale game kind of genre, and a lot of people are trying it out at the moment. If you're among these people, you maybe switched over from Smite or from Fortnite or any other game, and you find yourself being a new player trying to figure out how to work things out, I got you covered. In this video we'll talk about the basics of the game, some beginner tips and tricks, as well as some weapon choices and similar things, so some more information that is maybe a little bit helpful for advanced players as well. And with that, let's get started. So the first thing you have to do when you get into the game is you have to choose a class. I'll make this simple. At the moment, all classes are viable for different reasons. Not all have the same strength in terms of abilities or weapons, but all classes have their reason to be picked. As such, just pick what's most appealing to you and try it out and get a feel for it. If you're completely lost on your choice, then I would recommend starting out with warriors because they kind of all-rounders and have a bit of everything. I already made a guide for those which you can click up here if you want to learn more about warriors specifically. I will probably add further class guides here once they're done. So once you've chosen your class and you're in the game, the next question is, where are we dropping? The answer to that question obviously depends on your playstyle, but there are some good things to know in this context. A lot of the players will actually drop as soon as it's possible to drop out. As such, in the areas that are at the edge of the map, you will find a lot of players. If you want to fight right away, there's your chance to do that. A lot of players also drop at the edge of the circle. At the moment you can already see where the circle will be closing in towards when you're still in the air. I don't know if this will remain in the game, but right now as it stands, you can see where that will be, and on this particular map you see that it's kind of around Jaguar's Claw, Lumberfall, Crossing and Northport. So in these areas you can expect people to drop in this particular game. You will always find them among the borders there, kind of having the option to go further inwards when the circle goes more inwards. Areas with forges usually have quite a few buildings or structures around them, and as such will have a fair bit of loot around them as well. So it is generally advisable to land in an area somewhat close to a forge. There are other reasons for that as well, we get into that later. At the same time, you could also go into an area without a forge and be a little bit safer and loot some stuff first before getting into your early fights, which can be considered but can also put you at a disadvantage because you might get significantly less loot, so that's something worth considering. Something that I personally found advisable are areas slightly outside of the circle. So in this case that would be areas like Goldsmith Village, Valley, or for example Fungal Forest. These are not too close to the drop points depending on where the plane's coming from. They are also not too far away from the circle, so you know where to go. And you will be able to use the forge before the circle closes in at least once if you loot properly, and then can make your way towards the circle, while then having a reset on the forge for the next forge. I'll explain that a little bit later. In these areas you usually find one or two more groups that you have to fight, but that also gives you some advantages in terms of itemization, so in my opinion it's worth it. So at the end of the day the drop spot depends on your aggressiveness and your playstyle, but I would generally advise for somewhat in between where you can have some kills or some fights at least going, but also aren't completely threatened by a bunch of people fighting each other with knives at the start of the match. And that brings us to the second point, which is the start of the match. At the start of the match, the key is to loot very, very quickly. There are three types of chests in Royale. The first one is a weapon chest, the second one is a normal chest that can drop weapons or armor, and the third one is a potion chest that will only drop potions. So if you see the different kinds at the start of the match, the one you're gonna go for is the weapon chest. That will give you an immediate advantage over the enemy if they don't have a weapon yet, and that is something you should definitely utilize. The second best option is the normal chest. A potion chest will only do so much if you're getting knifed down and you don't have your mobility ability, so that's just your last option basically. If you're in a situation where you have to fight with a knife, it isn't terrible either. It actually got a nerf recently because it was a bit too strong. It's now 300 damage per hit, but you can most certainly knife an enemy down, and if you position yourself better and turn around better and use your mobility better, then you can definitely get an advantage over an enemy with a knife too, or even somebody with a gun if they're a bit clumsy with it. There is no shame in running away either though, if you don't have any weapons and you feel the enemy already has a lot of items before you get anything good. And in order to get away, which brings us to the next section of the more general tips, you can use your mount. If you press Z, you will get on your mount. And that is something that some people are not even aware of, which is very crucial for early game mobility, but also throughout the whole game. Whenever the circle is closing in, you want to get on your mount and move forward to the next position. If you're getting hit while on the mount, you automatically demount, but at the moment there is no further punishment than that, so you can use your mobility ability right afterwards and try to get some distance and remount again. I imagine that might change in the future. As you will normally be playing in duos or squads, another advice is to stay close together. Many abilities have a lot of synergy, and many abilities you can help each other somehow, and if you're not staying close together, then there's not much of a point in that. Likewise, when it comes to disenchanting things or sharding things as it's called mostly, then make sure your team doesn't need things either. You can see your allies' items on the left side, top left corner, so you know if they have a certain item of a certain quality or not. Communicate with them, ask them if they want it, and if not, shard it. But make sure to shard everything that's not needed, because the shards are very crucial to get into late game better. Also, the circle will start closing in over time. That means you want to go into the inner area of the circle, because otherwise you're going to get hit by the fog wall and the fog will consistently deal damage to you. As such, do not forget about the fog while you're busy looting. Keep an eye on the map, see where the fog is and how quickly it's closing in on you. As we already mentioned shards, let's talk about the forges. The forges are pretty much key to getting good equipment. There are also legendary chests that drop randomly on the map, but that's a bit more about luck than actually being able to get it guaranteed. If you get shards from items or from other players, then that's a guaranteed way to get better items at forges. Instead of looting them from enemies, is also the only way to get legendary gear and legendary abilities. The only thing that you get from chests are legendary weapons. In order to build a legendary armor piece, you need 60 shards. For a legendary ability, you need 90 shards. For a legendary weapon, you need 120 shards and a drumstick. You can get a drumstick by killing an enemy when you have already turned them into a chicken. The person who gets the last hit or the last shot on the chicken will then get a drumstick that can be used to make a legendary weapon. The legendary weapon that you can make at forges is always the same. You cannot make a random legendary weapon, you will make your class's legendary weapon, which you can see when you select the class. Other than that, you can only make one legendary ability and one legendary piece of armor per forge. And this is where the reset comes in, because if you go to another forge, that forge will have that completely reset and you can make another of each there. So you kind of need to keep moving around if you want to get a full legendary gear set and multiple legendary abilities, because otherwise at one forge you can just get one of each. The only thing that's not worth making are multiple legendary weapons, because once again, it's always the same one. Maxed out shards are 200, which means you can only make a legendary weapon and a legendary armor together, or you could theoretically make a legendary armor and a legendary ability as well. And don't forget that you can also make both armor and health potions at forges for relatively cheap. Another advice for forges: don't just stand there. Keep moving around, scout out the area, loot some more chests somewhere around it, because if you just stand there, you're a very easy target for enemies coming in unless you're perfectly set up with your team, as enemies will know that you're in the forge, as the forge has fire above it or smoke above it that will indicate that it's currently in use. Also, keep an eye on the fog timer on the right side. It will show you how long it takes until the fog comes in, and it takes 1 minute to make a legendary item and it takes 30 seconds to make those potions. So if the timer is already at 30 seconds, then maybe consider moving instead of making a legendary at that particular forge if the fog is already close to you. If it's only the first wave of fog, you have plenty of time, because that's much slower. When it comes to weapon choices outside of your legendary weapons, there are some things that are yet to be figured out, but there's a general tendency. The weapon that stands out above every other is the heirloom. It is a sniper, but it's also super good in close combat because it just has stupid high damage values. It can crit at 1400 when you have the legendary one, I think, so it's just way over the top, and if you find any variant of it, you should probably keep it. Then there is the rifle, which is technically not the best DPS weapon, but is very good because it also is good at long ranges and at shorter ranges. The revolver and crossbow are, in my opinion, roughly around the same level. The revolver is very strong in terms of damage or DPS in closer ranges, doesn't do much at long ranges at all, basically goes poof, whereas the crossbow is technically something that's better in longer ranges, but I find the projectile so slow and predictable that it's kind of hard to actually hit enemies with it, so I personally don't like it, but it's a style question. The poison gun also has a long bad drop off, so not a long distance weapon at all. At close distances it's alright, it also doesn't have the perfect DPS compared to other weapons. The shotgun is actually much worse than you would think. It technically has the highest damage and DPS values, but it has a massive spread and it only works at very, very close range. So at pretty much any range, the heirloom is better than the shotgun unless they're jumping right into your face, which is very unfortunate. I'm expecting the shotguns to get buffed sooner or later. And as an outlier weapon, there is the sword, which is actually not that bad in terms of damage, and if you can build around it and play around it with certain classes, it actually works. But outside of that, you obviously want to have ranged weapons over melee weapons most of the time, as it's just a lot harder to actually get into close range and not have an enemy jump away from you when that happens. I could break down the weapons in more detail here, but I saved that for another video, as I think for a beginner it's good to have an overview of where the weapons roughly stand, and obviously this is partially opinion based as well, depending on the feel. So just try out the weapons and see what works for you, as long as you don't toss out the heirlooms because they're super good. Combat is very straightforward. Aim for the head with weapons that actually utilize that, and try to peek when you can and not expose yourself to enemies too much. In that context, it's worth noting that there is a crouch function, so make use of that where you can. It can save your head, basically. Use your abilities to the most effectiveness, meaning that you shouldn't toss them out at the beginning of the fight, but you also should not forget to use them before you die, because quite often they can be very game-changing, more depending on which class you play though. And last but not least, if you're in a team with the right abilities, don't be afraid to rush the enemies, especially if you don't have a lot of long-range weapons. So for example, if you have an engineer and a warrior and you can drop down a shield to get from one position of safety, one hiding spot to the next one, and make your way up to the enemies and then just charge them down, that may actually be better than trying to snipe them for 2 minutes in a row with little effect. It just depends on the communication with your team, the coordination, and what kind of gear you have, but it can be worth considering, because I see a lot of people playing passive and then suddenly being rushed unexpectedly by players that just go out more ballsy than them. If you find yourself in the unfortunate situation that you actually get shot down and turn into a chicken, there are two things that you can keep in mind. A, use windows to your advantage. Players cannot get through certain windows because their models are too big for that, with the exception of the assassin who can blink through windows, and as such, if you jump to the other side of a window, it can often save your life or maybe even juke back into it when the enemy goes outside afterwards. Also, don't move when you don't have to. If you stand completely still, the chicken will stop making sounds after a few seconds. So you can just wait in one area, not move, and you will be pretty much dead silent. If you start moving, the enemy will hear you, because as long as you're moving, your chicken makes noise. This should go without saying, but don't stand somewhere where you're already being sniped by someone, because then they're just gonna shoot you down. There are a lot more things I could go on about here, but at this point you probably have enough information to just jump into the game and try those out first. In future videos I will be talking about DPS comparisons between the different weapons, for example, or what I would recommend for key bindings and things like that. As such, thank you guys very much for watching. If you're new to the channel, feel free to hit the sub button and hit the bell, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.